Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are going to learn about how to fetch data from an API. So, what does an API stands for? Well, an API stands for Application Programming Interface and is used by our application to fetch certain data in real time. Now, you must be thinking, what is that? So, let's take example of Bitcoin, right? Everyone knows what the price of Bitcoin is right now, or you must have heard at some point somewhere in your life. So there are many apps in Play Store and App Store in which you can see the price of current price of Bitcoin, right? So how does these apps fetch the price of that particular Bitcoin at a particular moment of time? Well, for that there are lots of API providers that provide these certain apps with the current price of Bitcoin. In short, in this application, we are going to send a request from a computer to a server, and in return, we are going to get a response from that server. It also contains, well, it's obvious, the data we want. So let's move right into it. Now the question arises, how do we send such requests to our server? There are different ways to send requests to the server. We will just take a look at two of the most popular ways to send the request. One of them being the fetch, which is an inbuilt API in our browser, and another is a library, popular library in fact, known as Axios. Now, without wasting any further time, let's get into the coding part and see how we are going to make a React application. First, we will create a folder in our React series and name the folder, let's say, fetch API. Then we are going to open the project in our VS Code. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to dive into my desktop, React folder, and fetch API. And I'm going to open this. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to create a React project here. So let's create it. npx create React app, and let's name it fetch API and let it run. What we are going to do is cd over to our application folder and write npm start to churn up our application. After our application is started, what we are going to do is clear everything in our app.js folder. So let me resize this and clear everything inside this div, and we don't need this logo folder, so I'm gonna remove it. Okay, so what we are going to do is we are going to do um, we are so what we are going to do is create state to store the data fetched from the API. Secondly, we will use a button to render out a particular element of that data. So let me create the state first. Const, I'm gonna name our state maybe f data and set f data and use state here, and this use state have will be initially an empty array. As this is we are going to import this state as it is, we have not imported the state. Where is that? Now let me import this state from React. Okay, now it's done. The second thing we want is to fetch the data. So for fetching the data, we are going to create a function, and I'm going to call this function API, let's say API fetcher. For the sake of simplicity of this video, I'm going to fetch the API from a website called fakestoreapi.com. Uh, Let me show you. So Fakestore API is an open API, and you can go to fakestoreapi.com to see that API. So I'm going to click on read docs, and in here I'm going to go on products. It clearly states that the API endpoint is this. Now let me show you how an API actually looks. An API looks like this. Just some garbage and crumbled up data that users don't want, the end users don't want. But as backend API developer and even front-end API developer, we need to make this look a little bit beautiful. So that's what we are going to do. We are going to copy this endpoint, API endpoint, and I'm going to store this API endpoint in some variable. Let's say FA fetched API data. Let's say fed. Okay. So I'm going to use fetch function here and see and try to see the output, what it returns. And let me console log it. Console.log. Okay, it's not a function. Fed. Fine. And let me run this function API fetcher. Now let's see what happens in our application. We are going to click on our application tab, go to the console log and see what's going on. See, we have something called promise, and it's saying that promise is fulfilled. So basically we are getting a response from that API which is being sent as an as a promise. So how do we resolve this? To resolve this, we are going to make this function an async function, and we are going to await the fetch. And let us try this again. Yes, now we are getting something else. We are getting a different response. We are not getting pending promise as we are getting earlier. So this response is a normal response, and this fetch API can be used to return a promise. So what we are going to do is write dot then, and we are going to play with this response, and we are going to return this response as response dot. See, it was really garbled up thing when we visited that API endpoint, right? It was totally garbage. So we are going to convert this response as a JSON object. Now, what happens is we are getting something else here. What we are getting is what we wanted, right? We wanted to get all these items in our fake store API. Now, let us see how we are going to render these objects, right? To render these objects, the object we just received, we are going to create another then method and use the JSON we just received and save it in our state we created. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to save the set if data, and I'm going to save this f data as the JSON we just received from the API. Okay, now here what I'm going to do is create h1 header with a name, let's say API fetcher. And thus I'm going to create a div and show the fetched API here. So you see we are getting a lots of objects. So what we are going to do is we are going to map these objects and create a paragraph element for each of the item we are getting from fake store API. Let me map the data that is stored in this set f data. To map data, what we are going to, and render, of course, render the data, what we are going to do is open the curly braces and write f data dot map and use item and return a div, another div with key as, I don't know, maybe item dot id, and this div will contain a paragraph element, and this paragraph element will contain something that we want to display or render. So I just want to render the title of each item, and let us check if it's rendering correctly. You see now we are getting something here as something is continuously going on. It is happening because the whole API fetcher is re-rendering itself. Now to prevent this issue, so what I'm going to do is use a hook, inbuilt hook by React, that is called useEffect. And okay, let me use the snippet tool to use the use effect and empty this. As we don't have any dependency, I'm just going to paste this API fetcher function here, and see now everything is working as expected. If I'm going to refresh it, we are out of this continuously running problem because of use effect, and we are getting all the titles that we got from our API endpoint, that is fake store API. All the titles of the items are here. If you want to let's see, get the price of each item, what I can do is I can change this title to item dot price, and we'll get the price of each object. Let me put a sign here to make it more readable. You see, basically we use the use effect so that re-rendering doesn't occur continuously. So there is another method we can use to stop this. For this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a button here and name it, let's say, fetch API, and this will fetch the API data. And on click, I want to create an on click function here and name it, let's say, fetch. Okay, fetch me. And let me create a function here, function fetch me, and put this API fetcher right into this function. So this will only render when we when we click on the button, this will only render. So we can also avoid the use of this use effect hook provided by React. So let me refresh the page and check if this is working. If I click on fetch API and give it some time, and here it is. Now I'm fetching the API as I want it. So this is how you can use a button to render the data we are getting from the API. So we have two methods here in the fetch API by using use effect with state, also using this button with a state. I guess this video is getting too bit lengthy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the library thing I told you earlier about, the Axios library, in the next video. That's all for now. Have a great day ahead.